Now, we've already focused on the three fish classes. Now we're going to move into amphibians. Amphibians are cold-blooded, which is referred to as ectothermic. Remember, this doesn't mean that the blood is cold. This means that the body temperature changes with the environment. So if the water or the air is cold, if it's winter time, the animal will start slowing down and go into hibernation. Now, amphibians are distinguished by being aquatic or water-dwelling. When they are babies, when they have a larval state, so we go eggs, larva, which is the tadpole, they're going to have a gill breathing stage. And so basically in this larval state of a tadpole, specifically for frogs, they're going to have gills. But then when they start going through a metamorphosis, a change, they're going to become terrestrial, land-focused, land-dwelling. And their gills are going to be lost. They're going to be modified. They're going to go through a puberty that's going to change the gills, and then they start developing lungs for the terrestrial, the land state. So they can go back to water, but they don't have gills anymore. They can't breathe underwater. They will have to come up for oxygen as an adult. Now remember, this is class Amphibia, so we have kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, then class Amphibia, kingdom, phylum, class. Now the term amphibian refers to a double life. This could be referring to the metamorphosis. This could be referring to being a tadpole having gills and then changing from having gills to having lungs. This can also be referring to going from a tadpole, which is aquatic, to now moving on to land, which is terrestrial. So that double life means a change from one aspect of its life cycle changing to another aspect. Now, there's more than just frogs in class Amphibia. I'm going to focus on frogs, but there's salamanders and newts, which have tails. Frogs and toads do not have tails. And then we have Siccilians, which are going to be having no legs. Frogs do not have scales. Now, reptiles have scales, even birds have scales on their legs, but frogs do not have scales. Now, toads do not have scales either. They may have more of a rough, bumpy skin, but no scales. So all amphibians, no scales. Now, specifically dealing with the frog, we're going to look at this when we dissect the frog, that the frog's tongue is actually attached in the front of the mouth. It's kind of like a little catapult. It stretches out to get the food. It does control it. Now, when you see the frog's tongue, because the animal is dead, the frog is dead in the dissection, the tongue will not stretch out. Amphibians, many of them being terrestrial as adults, will come back to water to lay eggs, to reproduce. And then we will focus on the metamorphosis of the frog, the egg, the tadpole, which has the gills, and then that then changes to the frog, which develops the lungs and then develops the legs. Okay, here's a picture of the frog's tongue and how it's being used and how it's attached to the front of the mouth. Okay, here's the metamorphosis of the frog. You can see the tadpole. After about 2 months, it starts developing those legs. Now we're going to start focusing on the circulatory system and the different organs of the frog. As you can see that the frog has 3 chambers. Now humans have 4 chambers. Humans have 2 atria, 2 upper chambers, and 2 ventricle, 2 lower chambers. But the frog does not have 4. The frog only has 3 chambers. It only has 1 ventricle. It has 2 atria and 1 ventricle. So the blood is going to enter the pulmonary veins into both the left and right atrium, and they're both going to come into the ventricle and then out of the arteries. Now, vein brings blood to the heart. Arteries, think of A for away. Arteries bring blood away from the heart to the body cells. Okay, as you can see here, basically we have a comparison of and a contrast of salamanders and newts, frogs and toads. You can actually see the visual differences as well as some of the physical character traits of the external anatomy. such as salamanders having round tails versus the newts more flat tail. Where are they going to be living? If they're going to be primarily living in water, such as the newts, they're going to have less slimy skin. Salamanders are more terrestrial, so they will walk on land. So they need more of a slimy skin to keep them moist. Then we also have some coastal grooves on the side of the salamander to help it absorb oxygen as well. Frogs are going to be skinnier, more smooth, slimy skin, long jumping legs for jumping long distances or a lot longer than what the toads will. Toads will be doing more walking or short little hops, not long jumps. And the toads will have more of a rough, dry skin. Sometimes toads can secrete a mucus for protection as well, but they do not have scales. Now, salamanders and newts are called tetrapods, as well as the frogs and toads. What is a tetrapod? Tetra meaning four. That means they have 4 legs, and they're going to walk with a side-to-side movement using left and right. Frogs are also tetrapods, meaning 4 legs, no tail, and long muscular hind or back limbs for jumping. Web feet for swimming. Even though they're terrestrial, they'll go back to the water to swim. And here's something that you will need to know when we focus on the frog, is that the eardrums, which is the tympanium or the tympanic membrane, is observable. And we can see those, and we'll actually be able to see that in the lab. The eyes are bulging. The eyes also have, for many of the frogs that can swim in water, they have a third eyelid. 2 eyelids to open and close the eye, but 1 that acts as an underwater goggle. Toads, as we said, okay, tetrapods as well, okay, shorter legs for jumping, and as we said, a mucus or a toxin released by glands to help them from predators. Okay, here's our Siccilians. You can see these are amphibians. There's no scale. This is not a snake because there are no scales. This is an amphibian. It's legless. It burrows, kind of like what maybe a worm would do, but it's not a worm. You can see the cephalized region of the head and mouth, and these live in South America. Now, we're going to focus on the terms that you see here dealing with the frog. I'd like you to either use Google or listen to this video as I describe it. If you do use Google or you use the internet, make sure it's correct because you don't want to be writing it down and it being wrong. So the first one is the nictitating membrane. This is actually that third eyelid I was just talking about. This is like an underwater eyelid, allowing the frog to see underwater and maybe catch fish or swim around things, get away from predators, but also it protects the eye. So it's an underwater goggle or eyelid. So it's a third eyelid. Then we have the tympanic membrane. The tympanium is the eardrum, and this is for absorbing vibrations, essentially for hearing. Then you have 2 types of teeth. You have the vomeron teeth and the maxillary teeth. The vomeron teeth, we're going to see in a picture, the vomeron teeth are 2 teeth on the roof of the mouth in the frog. So they're on the roof of the mouth, and when the frog closes its mouth, it's kind of like 2 large rocks kind of pinning down its prey. So the vomeron teeth, there's only 2 of them, and they're on the roof of the mouth. And they aid with holding down the prey, the food. Then you have the maxillary teeth. This is teeth or little tiny bumps. Not really like teeth that we have, but these are little tiny bumps along the maxilla. Remember, the maxilla is the upper jaw. So these are little tiny bumps or teeth on the upper jaw. And there's many of them, not just 2. Then we move to the glottis. Okay, the glottis is basically the opening to the breathing tube, the opening to the trachea. Now we have something called an epiglottis, which is basically this little lid on top of the trachea that prevents us from getting water down into the lungs. The little frog does not have the little lid on it, so they just have that opening down to the lungs. Then you have the esophagus. The esophagus is the swallowing tube, so we go mouth, esophagus. So as the food passes through the pharynx, it goes down into the esophagus, down to the stomach. So that's the swallowing tube. It's a muscular tube to squish food down. Then you have the eustachian tubes. The eustachian tubes are the tubes in the ear. So if you ever felt pain in your ear, let's say you're flying in an airplane and it's going up and you feel these bubbles like your ears are popping, you have pain in the side of your head where your ear is, that's actually the little tube that connects the ear to the throat. And basically, it can swell up, air bubbles can get in it, so it can ache and it can hurt. So that's going to be the eustachian tube. It connects the ear to the throat to relieve pressure in the head. So that's pretty cool how God designed to relieve pressure. There's this space, this tube between the ear and the throat. Okay, here we have the frog anatomy, specifically the head. We're going to take a look at that in some worksheets. We have the external nostrils, we have the mouth, eye, and then the eardrum. Now, another name for the nostril you need to know is the nare, N-A-R-E, and another name for the eardrum is the tympanium or tympanic membrane. Then if we move at the internal mouth, we can actually see that there are two nostrils on the roof of the mouth. We don't have that. The frog has external nostrils or external nares, and then also has internal nares. Then we have the vomerine teeth, those two little kind of bumps on the roof of the mouth. And then we have the maxillary teeth. You have the glottis, which is the opening to the lungs. And then you have the esophagus, which just goes right to, and that's basically an opening kind of on the top of that area that leads right to the stomach. And then you can see the tongue. And remember, it's not attached closer to the esophagus. It's attached at the bottom of the mandible. You can see here's a zoom up version of the mouth, and I forgot to talk about the eustachian tubes, and basically that's going to be that connection between the tympanic membrane and the throat, the pharynx. Yes, this is a better version that the esophagus is an opening leading to the stomach, while the glottis is a little vertical slit. The glottis is a vertical slit that leads to the lungs. Now these internal organs, they are not in order. We'll talk about the actual order. We'll look at the visual of it as well, but I'm going to go through and explain what it is and also what it does, what's the function. So here we have the large intestine. This is a shorter intestine when comparing to the small intestine. This is going to be also known as the colon. Now the colon or large intestine will absorb water. It does not have a digestive function, but it does absorb the water. If the large intestine is not doing its job, it will come out probably as diarrhea. Then we have the small intestine. The small intestine does lead into, or the small intestine is before the large intestine. The small intestine does contain 3 parts. We're not going to talk about those names. Maybe when you go to high school anatomy, basically we'll talk about those. The small intestine is the longest, of course. It's not really small, but it is thin, and but it is very long. So maybe it should have been called the long intestine. I don't know. But the small intestine will digest protein, sugar, and fat. So it's going to digest all 3 main macromolecules. Then we have the atrium. Now the atrium is the upper portion of the heart. This is going to receive blood first. And the atrium, think of the letter A, looks like it's pointing to the top. Then you have the bottom portion or bottom chamber of the heart, which is called the ventricle. If you look at the V, it looks like it's pointing down. So the ventricle is the lower portion. It will actually pump the blood out of the heart. So it goes atrium, then ventricle. Attached to the ventricle is usually the aorta. That artery brings blood away from the heart. So the atria is the first chamber of the heart, then that's the upper chamber, and then the ventricle is the lower chamber. Then we have the lungs, which are the respiratory organs. The lungs actually branch out like a tree, and they actually have little balloon-like structures called alveoli. And so when we breathe, oxygen is going to, or air with oxygen is going to enter our nasopharynx, oropharynx, down to our pharynx, down to our throat, and then not the esophagus, but down to the trachea. And it's going to go through our epiglottis, and then down to the trachea, and then the bronchial tubes will branch out like that tree, and then to our and inside our lungs into our little alveoli, which are little balloons. And at the alveoli, these little tiny balloons, basically we have little blood vessels. We have small blood vessels called capillaries. And those capillaries will pick up the oxygen and then transport it throughout our body to our cells. Then we have the liver. The liver is a large organ. It's usually a brown organ that is above our stomach, but it is below in mammals and humans. It's below the diaphragm. So it's going to be the start of your abdominal cavity. So in the thoracic, you have the lungs and heart. Then you have the diaphragm that separates the lungs, heart from the abdominal cavity, separating the lungs and heart from the liver, stomach, and so on. Now, the liver is going to detoxify. It's going to try and purify the blood. It's going to also try and break apart fat. The liver will secrete enzymes into the small intestine to help it digest fat. So the liver is part of the digestive system, but it's not part of the alimentary canal, meaning food does not pass through the liver, but it does help the small intestine digest fat. And the spleen is a small little bag that actually takes in red blood cells. It is considered part of the immune system as well. Now, the gallbladder is below or on the inside of the liver. Now, the liver does have many kind of folds or lobes. Now, under those lobes, you have the gallbladder. The gallbladder is also like a little balloon, kind of like the spleen, but this is more of a greenish color. And the gallbladder is actually going to secrete bile. And bile is actually the substance that will break apart fat. And this bile can be taken in by the liver as well as the small intestine. And the bile is this greenish, brownish fluid that is actually made by the liver, but it's stored in the gallbladder. The conus arteriosus basically is the upper right part of the ventricle in the heart. This is kind of like a little pouch, so it is dealing with the heart. Now, I'm not going to assess you on this. You may see it in the future if you're in anatomy. So let's move down to the esophagus. We already said the esophagus is the swallowing tube. This goes and connects the mouth, pharynx, down to the stomach. So this squishes. This is a muscular tube that squishes and pushes the food. Now, when we eat food, usually it's in a ball called a bolus, and the esophagus squishes down that bolus down to the stomach. Now, the pancreas is a large, kind of yellowish organ behind the stomach, and this actually secretes digestive enzymes into the small intestine. The pancreas is going to help with insulin production. Now, the stomach is going to be the first organ coming in the body that's actually going to be coming out of or connecting to the esophagus. It's actually the first organ that's going to be doing digestion. This is going to be actually the first organ that's going to be doing the digestion, primarily the digestion of proteins. Now, we're not really counting the mouth. Yes, the mouth is going to digest sugar through the salivary amylase, your spit, but when you swallow, it continues to digest, but you can't digest the proteins inside your mouth. It goes down to the first organ, and the stomach digests proteins. And the food usually lasts there for about 5 hours, and it's going to be churned and kind of turned into this material called chyme. And then the last one, of course, this is not with mammals, but this is specifically with fish, amphibians, reptiles, and birds. This is the one opening that connects the kidney, allowing for urine to come out, that connects the digestive system, allowing feces, poop to come out, and then also connects the ovaries, or allowing for the female and male gametes to come out. Okay, taking a look at this page, we can let's look at the top portion. I'm going to jump left and right. So you can actually see, let's look at the upper right one, the esophagus. It's pointing to that tube kind of behind the heart, and that tube is coming from the mouth down to the stomach. So you can see in the frog, the stomach is very long. It's kind of all the way through the body here, while our stomach will be more above the small and large intestine. And if we kind of move down into the heart, we can see the artery and the vein. Remember, veins are coming to the heart. If it's called a pulmonary vein, it's coming from the lungs to the heart, bringing oxygenated blood. Here we have the artery, specifically the aorta is a large artery coming out, and that artery is going to come out of the heart from pumping from the ventricle. So we have the left and right atrium, you can see are on top, and in the frog it's going to look a little brownish color. The two atria are going to look a little brownish in color, while the ventricle is going to look a little lightish, maybe a peach or pink color. And remember, there's only one ventricle. There's two atria, one ventricle. And when we look at the heart, it looks like a little acorn. Then we have two lungs, and the lungs are going to be dorsal. They're going to be more dorsal, so when we lay the frog ventral side up, the lungs are going to be in the back. And the lungs are actually going to be very bubbly. We're going to actually see a lot of these little bubbles, and that kind of... Then we have the liver, and you're going to see that the liver is going to have multiple lobes or separations, and that's going to be a very dark brown, reddish color. And then if we move down, you can see the gallbladder is kind of below, kind of nestled in the liver. Then we have the pancreas. And then if we follow the stomach down, you have the small intestine, and then you have the large intestine. And then right above the large intestine, you have the artery. Now, on either side of those arteries, you will see in those little spaces there, you'll see the kidneys. So then you have, let's go back to large intestine, which is the colon, and then you have the cloaca or cloaca. Okay, here's a little practice quiz. What I want you to do is on your Fitbin, go ahead and see if you can label these. See if you can label them without looking. Okay, if you need to go back, feel free and go back.